Trifles, Minnie's Decision to Kill Her Husband by Cheyenne Hux Gowers, English 1102, Professor Chauncey. Why Minnie Killed Her Husband. In the play, we find that Miss Wright is being investigated for the death of her husband. We come to find out what kind of man Mr. Wright was and why I feel that she was justified in killing him. We find evidence for her reasoning that I will go in depth with later. We don't get much evidence from Miss Wright herself, but I think her actions speak of abuse and isolation and a wild desperation to free herself from the chains that she was bound to for so long. That is where we will begin the analysis of the evidence. Evidence. Mr. Wright is found dead in his bed with a rope around his neck. The conclusion was that he was strangled to death while he slept. Miss Wright, when asked, doesn't give a reason to why he is dead. She just tells them that she found him that way in the morning. Miss Hale explains to Miss Peters what kind of man Mr. Wright was while they were collecting items to take to Miss Wright in jail. I think this part's very important because it speaks to why Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters kept the evidence to themselves. Later on, Miss Hale and Miss Peters stumble upon the dead bird that was found among Miss Wright's sewing, and ultimately they end up finding the reason why she killed her husband. And I also think this speaks to his character and why this drove her to do this. The questions we are left with are, why exactly do the women feel the need to keep this a secret? And why do they feel the need to save Miss Wright from a lifetime in prison? Why did Miss Wright ultimately kill her husband, according to the testimony of Miss Hale and Miss Peters? And was the fact that they kept this a secret justified? Analysis of the evidence at hand. This is the analysis of Mr. Wright's character according to Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Hale is talking to Miss Peters of how they were together and how Mr. Wright was as a man. Yes, he was a good man, and he didn't drink, and he paid his debts, but he was a hard man. She tells Mrs. Peters that he just, to pass the time of day with him, was like a raw wind that gets to the bone. Basically stating that he was a very hard man, very stern man. He kept to himself. There was no compassion, that he basically did his work, went and ate and went to sleep and had no interaction whatsoever with Mrs. Wright, and that living that way could be so very lonely. Analysis of the motive to kill Mr. Wright. The evidence shows us that Miss Hale and Miss Peters come upon a dead bird in Miss Wright's sewing, and that ultimately spelled out the motive for Mrs. Wright's actions. When Miss Hale comes upon the red box that she feels hold Mrs. Wright's scissors, Mrs. Hale discovers the fact that this dead bird from her canary cage is wrapped in this silk. It's wrapped in this silk because she took such care with it. She wanted to bury it. She loved it. It was something that she looked forward to. And when the women saw what had happened to the bird with its neck wrung, ultimately Mrs. Hale comes to the conclusion that Mr. Wright couldn't have something that beautiful in his house, because not only did he destroy this bird that gave her so much joy, he ended up destroying the very essence of Mrs. Wright herself, with the fact that she used to be so beautiful and outgoing, and she used to love to sing, and now she doesn't do any of those things anymore. And I think this plays into the fact of why she felt that way. Analysis, why they keep the evidence to themselves. After Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters find the bird, they find themselves in a hard situation. 1, they could tell the men what they found, or 2, they could keep it to themselves. I think as the women start to talk about their own experiences, that they decide right then that they are going to keep this evidence a secret. They start to see why Mrs. Wright felt the way that she felt, with the fact that Miss Hale and Miss Peters express their experiences. They're ultimately connecting to Mrs. Wright and being able to see the situation through her eyes. Miss Hale says if they've been there for years and years with nothing, and then there's a bird to sing to you, it would be awful for the bird to be gone, and suddenly that beauty and that song is gone, and all you are left with is stillness and silence. And Mrs. Peters goes on with her experience saying, I know what stillness is. I can relate to that because my first baby died, and after the baby passed away, I had stillness. I had nothing, and it created an isolation and depression. So I think these two women expressing their experiences can relate to Mrs. Wright and how she felt. Conclusion of the analysis. The character of Mr. Wright played a huge role in his death and why the events played out in the way that they did. Miss Wright, who was once young, pretty, and outgoing until she found herself in a loveless marriage with a stern, antisocial farmer. Her isolation, the gloom of her surroundings, and her husband's dispassion slowly drove her to the brink of insanity. She tried to fend off the depression with bits of gaiety, brightly colored quilting, and a caged songbird. But when her husband, in a sudden act of aggression, broke the cage and killed the bird and its singing, she was driven over the edge. I think this is the one huge reason, and ultimately the only reason, why she ended up killing her husband. I think that this just drove her to the brink, and she just could not handle the fact that she was just alone and isolated. Conclusion continued. I think that this shows why Mrs. Wright killed her husband, but I also think she was justified in doing so. The reason why I feel that she was justified in doing so was the fact that back then, in the 19th century, there weren't a lot of options for women. They couldn't go to college, they couldn't own property, and they couldn't have real jobs or careers to support themselves because the only thing they knew how to do were menial tasks. All they did was work around the house and support their husbands. Education was far and few between, especially for women who didn't have money. And especially the fact that women of that time period, divorce was not accepted. So the fact that she killed her husband, I think she felt that that was her only option of escape from this abuse and isolation. And that had been the only reason why she killed her husband. Why the women kept the secret. In my opinion, I think the reason why Miss Hale and Miss Peters kept the evidence to themselves was that they could relate to Mrs. Wright. The connection that they shared with their experiences allowed them to see her isolation, her depression, and her sadness through the eyes of Mrs. Wright. They could understand why she felt this way and how the only option was to kill him. I think that this also speaks to the fact of the time period, that the fact that women have to stick together because men did not understand. Women at the time were beneath them. So they felt that this really was her only option and that they can understand and relate to her in that way. Continue on keeping the secret. 50 years before the current women's movement, Susan Glaspell understood how conscientiousness raising could empower women to take actions together which they could not take as individuals. Now as women share their experiences, they could act out of a new respect for the value of their lives as women, different from, but certainly equal to, the world of man. I think that this shows the fact that the women had to stick together because they knew the men would not understand. Men don't have the same emotions, and men at the time thought that women were beneath them. A lot of that played into the fact of how the men talked to both women while they were in the room, speaking down to them as if they were not equal to them, even though women are equal to them. I do think that this plays into the fact that the women were so strongly connected to Miss Wright and felt the fact that they should keep this a secret because they were connected together, and this was something that only women could understand. Conclusion. I think that this gives the reasons why Miss Wright took her husband's life and why I felt that she was justified in doing so. With the fact that she was a woman in the 19th century, there weren't a lot of options. She couldn't move away. She couldn't be by herself. So there was no means for her to support herself, so the only way out was to kill her husband. I think the reason for the women keeping the secret was very clear. They knew Miss Wright's pain and felt that this was her only way out. I think the women truly felt that connection and felt that they were protecting her and that they understood why she did what she did and ultimately was justified in that action. We're excited.